In most societies, there is one particular language variety which is considered more prestigious or nicer or better than others. This language variety is usually known as the standard variety of that language. It's typically the variety which is taught in schools and the variety you're expected to use if you work in certain institutions such as government, education, or the media. Standard English is one such variety of the English language. The reason why it's considered standard is that it has traditionally been, and still is, the variety associated with people of power and prestige. This is a very important point to understand. Standard English has not been made the standard because there is something about it that is somehow better than other varieties of English. It's in fact the other way round. We think of it as being better because it is the standard. As an example, take the standard form you and the non-standard form yous of the second person plural pronoun. Now, if I didn't know anything about different varieties of English, there would be no way for me to look at these forms and decide on objective grounds that one is better than the other. They're just different forms of the second person plural used by different groups of people. Our idea that one form is better than the other comes from our attitudes to the groups of people who use these forms. Use is associated with people of relatively low socioeconomic status, and for that reason it's often viewed as incorrect or inferior. You is associated with groups of high status, with political or economic power and access to high status jobs, so it's considered better or more correct. It's important to understand that these perceptions don't come from any aspect of the language varieties themselves, but from our attitudes to the people who speak them. We think you sounds better because it's what people of certain social groups say, not because you is somehow a better second person plural pronoun. In fact, it's the same as the second person singular pronoun, so one could argue that yous actually makes more sense, because it lets you make a distinction between one person and more people. English is spoken as a first language in a number of different countries. There isn't a single standard English which is the same in all. In Britain and Australia, it's standard not to produce the at the end of words like car. In the US, on the other hand, the standard is to pronounce the and say car, and leaving the out is considered to be a feature of certain non-standard varieties such as Southern US English or African American English. Because there are these differences in what's considered standard in different English-speaking countries, we speak of Standard Australian English, British Standard English, American Standard English, and so on. One of the properties of a standard language is that it's considered the educational target. That is, schools are expected to teach students to use the standard variety of a language. Different students will come into school with different language backgrounds. Some will have been raised speaking standard English, or some variety close to it, and so will have few problems using standard English in a school context. Others come from a background where standard English is not widely used, and so they will essentially have to acquire a new variety of English as part of their early learning in school. It's important to realise that acquiring a new variety does not have to mean abandoning the variety they already speak. As adults, we're perfectly capable of adjusting our language to the context. For example, we know that the way we speak with friends in the pub may not be appropriate in a job interview. We choose which language variety we use according to how we wish to present ourselves in the particular context. Children are capable of doing this too. There is a difference between telling a child that the non-standard variety they speak is wrong, or bad English, on the one hand, and teaching them to use standard English in school or other contexts where it's considered appropriate, on the other. Adding standard English to a child's linguistic repertoire does not have to mean taking other varieties away. What exactly is standard English? What sets it apart from other varieties of English? we'll look at some of the grammatical properties which are typical of Standard English as opposed to most other varieties of English. The non-standard varieties that we will be comparing to Standard English include examples from various countries where English is spoken, and especially Britain. So not all the non-standard varieties that we will be looking at are used in Australia, but many of them should be familiar. The verb do has the same form in Standard English, whether it's used as a main verb or as an auxiliary. I do my homework, where do is the main verb. I do understand what you're saying, where do is an auxiliary. But many other varieties of English make a distinction between the main verb and the auxiliary form. So they say, I does my homework, where does is the main verb, but I do understand what you're saying, where do is an auxiliary. Standard English uses the S form of the verb in the third person singular present tense and the base form everywhere else. So we say I go, you go, he or she goes, we go, you go, they go. Many other varieties either use the S form for all persons, so I goes, you goes, she goes, we goes, you goes, they goes, or the base form for all varieties, for all persons, I go, you go, she go, we go, you go, they go. Standard English does not have negative concord. This is a grammatical property which is also often known as double negatives, as in, I don't know nothing. This is something that is found in many other varieties of English. There's a widespread perception that negative concord is somehow illogical, that a double negative makes a positive, and that therefore it makes no sense to use negative concord. In fact, negative concord is standard in the grammar of many other languages, such as French. It just happens not to be a feature of Standard English. And because of that, it's stigmatized among English speakers. That is, it has negative connotations, such as being bad grammar, uneducated, or incorrect. The system of reflexive pronouns is quite irregular in Standard English. Reflexive pronouns are the forms we use when the subject and the object of a verb is the same person, as in, I saw myself in the mirror, or he hurt himself falling off a ladder. Some reflexive pronouns are formed with the possessive form of the pronoun. So the form that we would use to talk about owning something, as in my book, your book, her book, and then the suffix self, myself, yourself, herself, ourselves. But not all reflexive pronouns are like this. Some of them are formed with the object form of the pronoun, not the possessive form. We don't say his self, we say himself. And we don't say their selves, we say themselves. Most English dialects have a more regular system where all reflexives are formed with the possessive form of the pronoun. So they do use the forms his self and their selves. Standard English uses the same pronoun both for second person singular and plural. So you can mean one person or more than one. Many dialects have distinct singular and plural forms. For example, thou versus you, or you versus yous. Standard English is highly irregular in the forms of the verb be. We say I am, you are, he or she is, we are, you are, they are. But many dialects have a much more regular pattern. For example, I be, you be, he be, and so on. In Standard English, irregular verbs show a difference between the past tense and the past participle. So the past tense I saw it is different from the past participle I have seen it. But irregular verbs don't show this difference. I washed it or I have washed it. Many dialects lack this difference between regular and irregular patterns, and so they use just one forms with all verbs. For example, I seen it and I have seen it. Standard English only has two demonstratives, this and that. So this house is the house here close to me, and that house is the house some distance away. Many English dialects in fact have three demonstratives, this, that and yon. So this house is the house here close to me, that house is the house some distance away, and yon house is the house very far away. There is a widespread perception that Standard English is somehow more logical and more systematic than other varieties of English. In fact, all varieties of English follow a strict set of grammatical rules. It's just that the rules are not the same for all varieties. If we look at the differences between Standard English and other varieties that we just discussed, we see that in many cases, Standard English is in fact more irregular and more grammatically restricted than other varieties. Standard English makes fewer grammatical distinctions than non-standard varieties in a number of areas. Firstly, the forms of the verb do, where Standard English makes no distinction between the forms of the main verb do and the auxiliary do, whereas many non-standard varieties do make such a distinction. Standard English does not make a distinction between second person singular and second person plural. It uses you for both. And it has only two demonstratives, this and that, where many dialects have three. In these areas, one might argue that Standard English is actually less expressive than non-standard varieties, as it allows for fewer meaning differences to be explicitly expressed through its grammar. Standard English is also more irregular than non-standard varieties in a number of areas. The forms of reflexive pronouns, where you have herself but himself, the forms of the verb be, and the distinction between regular and irregular forms in the past tense and the past participle. So we have saw has seen, but washed has washed. These are irregularities that serve no grammatical function and just have to be learnt. So in this sense, Standard English is actually less logical and systematic than the non-standard varieties. This just underscores the point that there is no objective way in which Standard English is better or more correct than other varieties. Different varieties follow different rules, and the rules of Standard English are no more inherently logical than those of any other varieties. The problem with the perception that Standard English is more logical and more systematic than other varieties is that not speaking Standard English is sometimes equated with being less intelligent or less able to learn. In the US, these ideas led to a landmark legal case concerning the use of non-standard English by schoolchildren. In the city of Ann Arbor in Michigan, a group of African American parents were concerned that almost all of their children were classified as learning disabled or as being in need of speech therapy. These supposed disabilities were then used to explain why these children got poor results in school. The parents, on the other hand, consider their children to have normal intelligence and normal learning abilities. They felt that the children were being unfairly discriminated against because they spoke a non-standard variety of English known as African American Vernacular English, and that they were not being taught appropriately for their language background. The parents took the school district board to court, claiming that the board had in fact failed in its duty to educate African American Vernacular English speaking children adequately. The judge ordered that the school district was legally obligated to do the following: recognize African American Vernacular English as the language of the children, develop a program to help teachers recognize African American Vernacular English, and offer teachers methods of using that knowledge in teaching Standard English to African American Vernacular English speaking children. In 1997, the Linguistic Society of America issued a statement where they emphasized that African American Vernacular English is just as systematic and rule-governed as any other varieties of English or other languages. This is just as much the case for the variety known as Aboriginal English, spoken in Australia, which we'll look at in the next lecture. We've spoken previously about the difference between prescriptive and descriptive approaches to grammar. A prescriptive approach is one that says that some ways of speaking are correct and that all other ways are incorrect. So it's concerned with how people should be speaking. A descriptive approach is one which simply describes the properties of different varieties of language, as we have done in this lecture. A descriptive approach is concerned with looking at what people actually say and does not make any judgments about some varieties being better than others. We can now see that a prescriptive approach to grammar is closely tied up with the idea of a standard language, because it's typically the standard language which is considered to be the correct language variety. And by implication, all other varieties are then incorrect. But remember that the standard is just a variety like any other, and it's only because of our attitude to the people who speak it that we consider it to be better. This means that prescriptive attitudes are really based on a set of social stereotypes regarding the social attributes, education level, social standing, and so on, of people who speak in a certain way.